Jake Mitchell never saw himself as the kind of man to start a fight. He was the sort who minded his own, worked his land, and asked for little more than a good sunrise and a quiet night. His farm, a wide stretch of rolling fields and weathered fences, had been in his family since before cars replaced horses on the roads. It wasn't just land to him, it was roots. Generations had worked this soil, sweat into it, and built a life out here where the sounds of roosters and wind through the crops were the soundtrack of a good day. And for the most part, that's how Jake liked things. Simple, predictable, his way. But peace, as Jake was about to learn, can be a fragile thing. And sometimes the biggest storms roll in, wearing expensive shoes and carrying a clipboard. Her name was Karen Whitmore. Jake first heard about her through town talk. President of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association, Karen had a reputation for running her suburban kingdom with the kind of strictness usually reserved for military academies. She was the type who would knock on a neighbor's door to point out their trash cans were left on the curb 30 minutes too long. No detail was too small, no rule too petty. Her kingdom sat just beyond the eastern fence of Jake's property, Crestwood Estates. 5 years ago, it had been cow pasture. Now it was a collection of cookie-cutter homes lined up in perfect symmetry, with grass cut to regulation length and mailboxes identical down to the shade of beige. Jake had watched it spring up like a weed, but it didn't bother him much. They stayed on their side. He stayed on his. At least that was the idea. The morning Karen showed up, Jake was sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee. The kind of morning where the sun was slow to climb and the world still smelled like damp earth. He spotted her right away. Beige suit, clipboard hugged to her chest like it was shielding her from a battlefield. She marched up the gravel drive like she owned it. Jake didn't move. He just watched her come, sipping his coffee and wondering how long it would take before she told him what he was doing wrong. "You must be Mr. Mitchell," she said, crisp as a cold wind. Jake nodded. "That's me. I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association." She said it like he should be impressed. "I wanted to have a conversation about your property." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know I was part of Crestwood Estates." Karen smiled, the kind of tight, professional smile that never reached the eyes. "Technically you aren't, but your land is adjacent to our community, and we have concerns." Jake took another sip, waiting. Karen glanced at her clipboard, like she needed the facts in front of her. "We've received multiple complaints about your operations, the noise, the smell, the visual impact." Jake set his mug down slow. "Visual impact?" "The large red barn," Karen said, her voice softening as if she thought she was breaking bad news. "It's bold. Perhaps a neutral tone would be better. And there's the rooster. Some of our residents are being woken before sunrise. It's disruptive." Jake looked at her for a long moment. 60 years that barn had stood there. Same red paint his grandfather had slapped on with a brush and a grin. And that rooster? Nature's alarm clock. Jake leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "So," he said, "you want me to repaint my barn and tell a rooster to sleep in?" Karen's smile twitched. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand change is difficult, but this is in everyone's best interest. Property values are delicate." Jake stood up, stretched his back, and let out a breath. "Well, Miss Whitmore, I appreciate the visit, but my farm isn't part of your HOA. I don't answer to your rules." Karen's jaw tightened. "We'll see about that." And she walked back to her SUV like she was sure the matter was settled. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. He dealt with stubborn mules and sick calves that didn't want to be doctored. But Karen? She was another animal altogether. It didn't take long for the games to start. First came the letters, official-looking papers on HOA letterhead, stuffed into his mailbox, demands that he comply with community standards as if they had any authority on his land. He ignored them. Then came the calls to the county, complaints about code violations, noise, smells. None of it stuck. Jake's farm was clean, lawful, and in perfect compliance with zoning regulations. But it didn't stop her. A week later, she showed up again, this time with 2 men in tow. Both wore the same smug expressions, holding clipboards like they were about to write him a citation for breathing. You again, Jake said, wiping his hands on a rag. He'd been repairing a section of fence when they drove up. Karen sighed like she was tired of him already. Mr. Mitchell, I was hoping we could resolve this amicably, but you've left us no choice. Jake crossed his arms. Because I won't repaint my barn? You do what you have to do, Jake said, voice low. But if you or anyone from your HOA sets foot on my land again without permission, I'll have the sheriff on speed dial. Karen's mask slipped for just a moment, enough to see the frustration beneath. Then she smiled again. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. Jake shook his head. Number you are. She left, but Jake knew she wasn't done. A few mornings later, he found an envelope shoved into his mailbox. No stamp. Delivered by hand after dark. HOA logo in the corner. Inside, a list of violations so ridiculous he almost choked on his coffee. Red barn color offensive to neighborhood. Rooster crowing before 8 a.m. Unauthorized livestock, goats, cows, chickens, not compliant with community standards. And a cease and desist demand to fix all of it within 7 days or face legal action. Jake tacked it to the fridge like a trophy and went about his day. But Karen had moved to phase 2. County inspectors showed up, one after another. Health department, zoning commission, animal welfare. Each came ready for a fight and left scratching their heads. Roger, the health inspector, looked worn out by the time he finished his check. Son, he said, I don't know who you pissed off, but this farm's cleaner than most hospitals. Wouldn't be a woman named Karen, would it? Roger chuckled. Off the record? Yeah, she's behind every one of these complaints. Jake shook his hand and sent him on his way, but he knew the visits wouldn't stop. Then came the letters, not official ones. Handwritten complaints slipped into his box. No signatures. But Jake recognized the tone. Karen's fingerprints were all over them. Your farm's smell is lowering our property values. The sight of animals is upsetting to our children. Mow your fields, or else. He almost admired the effort. Then one afternoon, he heard it, a chainsaw. Close, too close. He dropped his tools and walked toward the noise. And there they were, hired workers putting up a massive steel gray privacy fence on his land, cutting right through his property line. And there, standing like a queen surveying her empire, was Karen, clipboard in hand, smiling. Jake stormed up. What the hell do you think you're doing? Karen turned all innocence. Just making improvements for the community. On my land. Well, she said, we believe the original property lines were incorrect. Until we get clarity, we're proceeding. Jake locked eyes with the workers. You boys got permits for this? They hesitated. HOA told us they did. Jake smiled, but it wasn't friendly. They don't. And if you're not gone in 5 minutes, I'm calling the sheriff. That did it. They packed up. Karen fumed. Jake called it a win, but he wasn't stupid. He made copies of every deed, every map, every legal document tied to his farm. He sent a cease and desist to the HOA, filed trespassing warnings, and he let the sheriff know he was done playing. But Karen, she wasn't, not by a long shot. A week later, Jake woke up to find a giant for sale sign planted at the edge of his property. Below it, in bold letters, coming soon. Crestwood Estates Phase 2. Jake ripped it out of the ground, stomped back to his porch, and wasn't surprised when Karen rolled up not 10 minutes later. Oh, Mr. Mitchell, she said, smiling. Misunderstanding, I'm sure. Jake didn't smile back. Explain it. We're expanding. Some realtors assumed your land was part of the development. You assumed, Jake said. She tried to soften it. It's an opportunity. Jake took a slow step toward her. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell them to stay off my land. Next time I see a sign, I'm suing. Fraud, harassment. Karen's mask cracked again, but she turned and left. Jake knew the war wasn't over, but it was time to fight back. Jake wasn't one for paperwork, but he spent the next few days buried in it. Every scrap of paper tied to Mitchell Farms, every survey, every zoning approval, every faded deed his grandfather had scrawled a signature on. He had it all, copied, certified, locked in a safe, and stacked on his kitchen table. If Karen Whitmore wanted a war, He was going to make sure she didn't have a single foothold to stand on. But Jake wasn't just playing defense anymore. His first call was to Sheriff Tom Caldwell. They'd gone to school together, played ball back in the day, and Tom had always been a straight shooter. "Karen Whitmore giving you grief?" Tom asked when Jake laid it out. "She's not just giving me grief," Jake said. "She's filing bogus complaints, trying to build fences on my land, and now she's putting up signs claiming I'm selling the place." Tom let out a low whistle. "You want me to pay her a visit?" "Not yet," Jake said. "But if she or her people step foot on my land again, I'll be calling you." "You got it," Tom said. "And Jake?" "Yeah? Good on you for not decking her yet." Jake chuckled. "It's been close." With Tom in his corner, Jake turned his attention to the petty stuff. Karen had made a big stink about his rooster. Fine. He bought 3 more. Every morning at 5 sharp, like clockwork, they filled the air with enough crowing to wake the dead. Jake figured if they didn't like 1 rooster, they'd love 4. Then he decided to improve the view. Karen had complained his farm was an eyesore, so Jake planted a whole field of sunflowers right along the property line. Bright, tall, bold. By midsummer, they'd grow so thick and high the Crestwood folks wouldn't see anything but a solid wall of yellow whenever they looked his way. But the move that really put a burr under Karen's saddle? Jake went public. He called his old buddy, Mason, who ran the local farmers market, and pitched an idea. "What if," Jake said, "we bring the market here? Just on weekends." Mason loved it. Within days, they had flyers up all over town. Farmers Fun Day, free entry. Come meet the animals, support local growers, the works. The first weekend, cars lined up down the road, kids chased chickens, families snapped pictures in front of the red barn. Karen hated so much, and live music played from a makeshift stage Jake had built out of old pallets. It was loud, it was busy, and it was 100% legal. Karen showed up before noon, marching in like she owned the place, clipboard under one arm, lips pursed so tight Jake wondered if she could still breathe through her nose. "This is unacceptable," she snapped, shouting to be heard over a fiddler on stage. "You can't do this." Jake leaned against a fence post, arms crossed. "Doing it. You can't just turn your farm into a carnival." He shrugged. "County says I can. Zoning permits agritourism." Karen's eye twitched. "The parking, the noise." "All within the law," Jake said, "and folks seem to love it." A little girl squealed nearby as she hugged a baby goat. A group of teenagers were eating fried pies and laughing. Karen stood there, flustered, completely out of control. "I'll be bringing this up with the board," she warned. "Looking forward to it," Jake said. But Karen wasn't done. She never was. A few days later, Jake noticed cars parked along the road at weird hours. Nothing too unusual at first. But then a drone buzzed overhead. Then another. One evening, as he was shutting up the chicken coop, he spotted a guy with a camera just past the fence line, snapping pictures like he was on safari. Jake called out, "Hey!" The man froze, then tried to act casual. "Just, looking at the property lines." Jake climbed over the fence, calm but steady. "Who sent you?" The man coughed. "Crestwood Estates. Just verifying boundaries." Jake smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Get off my land, now." He left. But the next day, another HOA letter landed in Jake's mailbox. New accusations, zoning violations, unsanitary animal conditions, more baseless threats. Jake had had enough. He called his lawyer, got a formal cease and desist drafted, thick with legal threats and backed by every document he had. Then he showed up at the next HOA meeting. No invitation. He just walked in, wearing his oldest jeans and a look that said he wasn't in the mood. Karen was mid-sentence, lecturing the board about community standards, when Jake dropped a thick stack of papers on the table in front of her. The thud echoed. "You've been harassing me," Jake said. "Trespassing on my land, filing false complaints, spying. That stops now." Karen's face turned red. "You can't." "I can," Jake cut in, "and I will. Cease and desist. If you or anyone from this board so much as breathes in my direction, I'll sue every last one of you." The room was dead quiet. A few board members shifted in their chairs, avoiding Karen's glare. One woman finally spoke up. He's not even in the HOA. Karen's jaw clenched. He's disrupting the community. Jake leaned in. Number you are. And just like that, the tide turned. A few days later, Linda Matthews came by. Former board member, longtime Crestwood resident, and one of the first people Karen had pushed out of power. She brought a pie and a grin. "You're doing good work," she said. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Didn't expect the HOA to be handing out pie." Linda chuckled. "Most of us aren't like her. We're just tired of getting fined because our grandkids leave sidewalk chalk drawings." Over the next week, more residents came forward. Quietly at first, they started leaking information, emails, minutes from board meetings. Karen had been faking complaints, using fake names, pushing for special assessments to fund her legal crusade against Jake. Greg, one of the old vets in the neighborhood, showed up with a folder full of internal HOA documents. "She was trying to make us all pay to sue you," he said, shaking his head. "Thought we wouldn't notice." Jake whistled low. "And? She's losing support, fast." And it was true. Crestwood Estates was split now. Some still backed Karen, but most were done. Tired of the drama, tired of the rules. And when word got out that Karen had tried to block public roads by lining them with private community signs, the county came down on her hard. Jake got the call that night. Linda again. "They're voting to remove her." Jake smiled. "Took 'em long enough." An hour later, Linda texted again. "She's out. Karen Whitmore, dethroned, done." The next morning, Jake sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun come up over the fields. The roosters crowed, and somewhere far off, a moving truck backed into Karen's driveway. Rumor had it she wasn't just leaving the neighborhood, she was leaving town. Jake wasn't surprised. She'd ruled by fear. But once the fear was gone, all she had left was an empty clipboard and a reputation that wasn't worth much. He didn't celebrate. Not really. But he did order a sign. 2 weeks later, it went up along the road. "Welcome to Mitchell Farms, HOA free." Since 1923, it became a local landmark. And Jake? He got back to what he loved. Tending his fields, feeding his animals, running his weekend farm events, which were bigger and busier than ever. But he never forgot the lesson Karen had taught him. Sometimes the biggest threat to peace isn't a storm, it's a person who doesn't know how to mind their own business. And sometimes you've got to stand your ground, even if it means going to war. Karen Whitmore's name stuck around Crestwood Estates long after she was gone, like a ghost people pretended not to notice but whispered about when the lights were low. Rumor had it, after packing up her life and fleeing town with her tail tucked, she'd tried her luck in another neighborhood a few hours south, a place just like Crestwood. Rules, committees, manicured lawns. It was her dream all over again. Problem was, someone had beaten her to the throne. Word got back to Jake through Mason, who'd heard it from a buddy at the diner. Karen had rolled into her new neighborhood, thinking she could do what she did best, bully her way to the top. But the HOA there already had an enforcer, a woman twice as strict and twice as mean. Karen had walked right into a buzzsaw. She was hit with violation after violation. Grass half an inch too high, porch light bulb the wrong wattage, curtains not approved by community standards. The same petty nonsense she used to dish out was now landing in her mailbox by the truckload. Jake heard she lasted 2 months before she slapped a "for sale" sign on her house and skipped town again. He wasn't surprised. Karma has a long memory. And sometimes it enjoys irony. Meanwhile, back on Mitchell Farms, life found its rhythm again. The rooster chorus still kicked off the mornings, sunflowers swayed in the breeze, and the market weekends grew into something bigger than Jake had imagined. What started as a petty pushback against Karen had become a real draw for the town. Every Saturday, cars lined the road. Kids ran through the fields. Local bands played on that same stage Jake had thrown together from old pallets. He added hay rides in the fall, pumpkin patches, a corn maze. Folks came from towns over. Even people from Crestwood Estates showed up now. Families who had once kept their distance were buying fresh eggs, honey, and baskets of vegetables, shaking Jake's hand like they'd known him all along. Linda Matthews stopped by often. She helped organize events, brought baked goods, and made sure Jake never ran short of volunteers when crowds got big. She was different now, relaxed, happier, like a weight had finally come off her shoulders. "Funny how things turn out," she said one afternoon, sitting on Jake's porch with a glass of sweet tea. "Karen spent years making our lives miserable. Now half the neighborhood's out here on weekends, spending money on the farm she tried to get rid of." Jake smiled, not saying much. He preferred to let things speak for themselves. Crestwood Estates changed too. Without Karen breathing down everyone's necks, things loosened up. People painted their front doors whatever color they wanted. Kids chalked up sidewalks with drawings no one dared erase. Lawns grew a little longer, and nobody cared. The board had new leadership now, a man named Richard who made it clear he wasn't interested in running a dictatorship. One Saturday, Richard showed up at the market. Jake saw him from a distance at first, standing near the produce stalls talking to Mason. Eventually, he made his way over. "Mitchell," Richard said, offering a hand. "Didn't think I'd see you out here," Jake replied as he shook it. Richard smiled. "Figured I'd come see what all the fuss was about. Looks like Karen was wrong about you." Jake shrugged. "Not much fuss, just farming." Richard glanced around at the crowds. "You've turned this place into something good." Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. Richard got the message. After that, things settled into a new normal. Jake went back to farming full-time, but now with a side business he hadn't expected. Mitchell Farms became a destination, the kind of place folks talked about in town and told friends to visit. No HOA, no Karen, no rules except his own. But every now and then, Jake liked to remind people how things used to be. That big wooden sign he'd put up along the property line stayed there. "Welcome to Mitchell Farms, HOA free." Since 1923. Folks from all over came by to take photos next to it. Some locals even made shirts with the phrase on them, and soon they were selling like hotcakes at the farmer's market. Jake never cashed in on it. He didn't need to, but he did get a kick out of the fact that what Karen had tried to destroy had only made him stronger. A few months later, a letter showed up in Jake's mailbox. No HOA letterhead this time. No fake complaints or empty threats. Just a plain envelope. He almost tossed it before noticing the return address, Karen Whitmore. He stood there on his porch for a minute, debating whether to open it. Then curiosity won out. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in that stiff, prim script he remembered all too well. It was an apology, of sorts. Karen said she'd moved out of state. She admitted she'd gone too far, let things get personal. She mentioned starting over somewhere new, promising herself to stay out of HOA politics. Jake read it twice, then folded the letter up and slid it into a drawer. He didn't write back. He figured she didn't expect him to. Jake never told anyone about the letter. Didn't see the point. But every time he opened that drawer and saw it there, tucked between old farm receipts and seed catalogs, he'd shake his head and smile. People change, or they don't. Either way, he had work to do. By the end of that summer, Mitchell Farms was busier than ever. The market grew into a full-on festival once a month. They had contests, biggest pumpkin, best pie, fastest sheep. They raised money for the local school. Jake even built a small petting zoo for the kids. And on Sunday mornings, when the farm was quiet and the air still smelled like last night's rain, Jake sat on his porch, drank his coffee, and listened. Not for roosters or tractors or the laughter of kids in the distance, but for the silence of peace. The kind he'd fought for, the kind he planned on keeping. And if anyone came knocking again, clipboard in hand, thinking they could tell him how to run his land, well, they'd better pack a lunch, because Jake Mitchell wasn't moving, not for anybody.